I'll be running through some examples of constructed response questions and just going through some of the flaws that might occur in some of them. So we saw this one at the very tail end of the last video. It's a closed question or a fill in the blanks type question. Very useful for language testing, developing vocabulary, developing tenses, all those sorts of things. But it can be misused. There is a reading which you can have a look at to see how closed questions can be used, which is quite interesting if you have the time. Here's an example here. So J.R.R. Tolkien is a famous writer who wrote The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And one of his famous quotes is, "One ring to rule them all and one ring to bind them." Now this is essentially just a memory question. There's no real vocabulary here. It's basically saying, have you listened or read the book and can you remember the words that go in there? Essentially, it's not really very useful. There's too many blanks. And this is one of the criteria for closed questions, is try not to have too many blanks. 1 or 2 is usually sufficient. When it gets bigger than that, it ends up being a complete guess. Any number of words could fit into that particular scenario, and therefore it doesn't necessarily make a good constructed response question. You'll note also that this is a very low-level constructed response question. Essentially, it's one of the lower ones. It's relatively easy to mark afterwards, and so therefore has some advantages in that it can actually test a little bit of breadth, more so than short answer and essay questions. So here's another one where there's a text from a book. It contains 12 errors. Identify and correct each error. There's a mark allocated for each error that you need to identify. And essentially, the students just need to understand some stuff. They may circle it or write down the answers. And it's quite a reasonable question. There is a problem though, and the problem will be is if there's more than 12 errors. So if you're actually going to set questions of this sort of nature, then be very, very wary to make sure that you actually get things really correct. So where you want to look for 12 errors, you might actually want to identify 14 and make sure that at least 12 can be identified. You'll note that the marking scheme there, that those 12 marks, probably you could allocate 12 minutes for that particular task. So we talked briefly about how much time and how many marks you allocate for each different type of question. So we talked about a multiple choice question being worth 1 mark and taking approximately 1 minute. For me, this one looks like it might take a bit of time. You've got to read through the text that's there and then identify the errors. 12 minutes seems reasonable. And as it turns out, it's conveniently matches the number of errors that we've put for this particular question. Here's another example question. So there's a stem to this question. It says the air in our atmosphere contains 78% nitrogen and other bits and pieces. And then there's 2 questions associated with it. What are 2 important characteristics of oxygen that makes it important? 2 marks. And what will happen if the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is doubled? 2 marks. So these are constructed response questions, clearly short answer. They're only worth 2 marks. You're looking for maybe 2 minutes worth of work from the student, and hopefully they can interpret what that question says and answer it the way that you want to answer it. The issue with constructed response is that you actually don't know what the answer is going to be, and if you've been too lax or haven't verified the quality of your questions, you can run into problems. So what are 2 important characteristics that make it important? That's a fairly open question, and any number of answers could come through. From the teacher's point of view, we're interested in knowing how we're going to mark this. Okay, so what are we looking for? So we might give 1 mark for the importance of oxygen for respiration and energy production. Note though that there's 2 aspects to that. 1 mark for its role in water or microbiology, 1 mark for increasing the greenhouse effect, 1 mark for discussing outcomes from the greenhouse effect. So there are variations here, and this marking scheme here is relatively general, like for the second one, for example, 1 mark for its role in water, microbiology, other. So it does actually give the teacher a fair bit of scope in allocating marks for this particular question. It also makes it particularly difficult if you've got multiple markers for this one question, because there is no real definitive answer, because the question hasn't been cut down and defined clearly enough. So here's something that's much more broad. Discuss the role of oxygen on our planet. This is more of an essay or a short essay type question. You might consider developing a rubric for this particular one so the students actually have some idea of what role of oxygen you want them to discuss. often you see constructed response questions giving you options. So here's an example. Choose one of the following questions. Solar system has 8 planets, but 10 years ago there were 9. Explain how this occurred and why. 20-minute question, so note that there's some time defined for this. Describe, or alternatively, describe the history of space travel from 61 to 1985. 20-minute question. On the face of it, these look similar. They're both meant to take 20 minutes to do. They're both related to space travel or space in some sort of way. But they are essentially very, very different questions. So the first question actually needs to have some understanding of what is a planet, how they're defined, and the politics and the scientific discussion that went around what defines a planet. So it's quite an in-depth critical analysis of the whole concept of what a solar system is. The second one really is just a list. So if you've remembered a whole bunch of things that happened on particular dates, that's a very easy question to do. So although the students have got a choice of one of the following questions, students who choose the first one are potentially more disadvantaged because it is a more difficult answer than the second option. So options not always a good idea. In fact, they are rarely a good idea. Ensure that each of your students sits through the same sort of testing process. So there is a story, a fairy tale story, where a young boy called Jack bought some beans, magic beans, after he sold his cow. He planted the beans and it grew into a giant beanstalk. He climbed up it, stole some stuff from a giant and became rich. So the question here is just asking the student to explain the series of events, except it's using some weird wording. So the teacher's thinking, I can be a bit clever here, or I can teach the students a new word while they're doing their test. So instead of explaining the events that occurred to allow Jack to become a rich person, it says explain the serendipitous events, which is sort of a fortunate accident that occurred to allow Jack to become rich. So when you're setting your questions, make sure that the wording is not unnecessarily complex, and in fact the simpler the better. Another fairy tale. So there's a story of 3 little pigs. So 3 pigs, one made his house out of straw, one made his house out of sticks. A more industrious pig made his house completely out of bricks, which took a lot longer, but was obviously more sturdy. And then a big bad wolf came along, blew down the straw house, blew down the stick house, but couldn't blow down the brick house. And eventually the pigs lured him to his doom. So here's the question. The story, The 3 Little Pigs, has many characters. Identify 3 characters in the story and tell what each made their house of. So the question here has a flaw. It's basically wanting a particular outcome. In fact, it wants you to talk about the 3 little pigs because it's asking you about what they made their houses out of. But there are actually more than 3 characters in the story. There are 4, of course, the wolf being the other one. And therefore, this question is misworded. If they chose the wolf to talk about, then they can't talk about how they made their house. And so the students, therefore, may get a little bit confused. So this short answer question has flaws because it's not clear about what it wants. So you might choose to reword it. The story of The 3 Little Pigs has many characters. Choose one character and describe 2 traits of the character. Explain how the character's traits lead him to act the way he does. And that allows the students to choose any number of characters from the book. Here's another example of a particularly ordinary question. So I will read this out if I can possibly manage not to stumble over the words. Based on the 10-week unit of study on the 3 branches of government that our class has just concluded, please indicate whether you believe the legislative, executive or judicial branch is the most powerful. Defend your choice as persuasively as you can using relevant arguments and evidence. Please do so using the paper supplied or employing one of the computers in our classroom in 500 words or less. Your response to this item will count for 1/3 of this test total, and you should spend no more than half an hour in composing your response. So there's a lot of information there. Some of it is relevant, some of it is not. So the whole first section of it, based on the 10-week, that could just be deleted. And the question could be, which of the legislative, executive or judicial branches is the most powerful? And that could be sufficient. The fact that they need to defend their choice as persuasively as you can using evidence is kind of irrelevant, because if you allocate enough marks to this particular question, and the word length will guide them as well, then they should be able to figure out that they actually need to write something meaningful rather than just writing down words that don't mean anything, of course. So in this case here, you would cut the question down to something very short. In brackets, maybe at the end, you might say 500 words, 30% of the test mark or something like that. And therefore, the students will be able to distill what the question is actually asking. At the moment, it's very, very dense, and students might actually make some bad decisions because the wording is too much. So, some general item writing guidelines for constructed response items. Having had a look through the examples, let's have a look at the short answer ones. So, choose direct questions over incomplete statements. Structure an item so that it seeks a brief, unique response. It's really a key that in short answer questions that it is not possible to have multiple answers. The oxygen question that we talked about was very, very broad and therefore would cause problems for the students, and in particular would cause a lot of problems for the teachers marking it. If you're going to use response blanks at the end of statements, and I suggest you don't put them at the end, I would suggest that you actually just word questions properly, and so avoid having blanks at the end. And I know that is a convention which is used in some countries, but it is not particularly good. For incomplete statements such as closed questions, restrict the number of blanks to 1 or 2. Make sure all the response blanks are equal in length. So don't have a blank which might have the word astronomy in it and another blank which has the word the in it. It confuses the students. And make sure you've got sufficient answer space, either online or on paper, and that will provide the students with some guide about how much they're meant to write. When it comes to essays, make sure that the particular task of the essay is really clear and has boundaries so that the students don't just go off on wild tangents that might cause them to spend a lot of time and waste it instead of actually focusing on the task that you wanted them to do, as opposed to the one that they interpreted. For each question, this goes for the short answers as well, make sure you specified a point value, appropriate length and appropriate time. Employ more questions requiring short answers rather than fewer questions requiring long answers. The reason for that is that you can cover more breadth, it's a bit easier to mark, and often you can actually test the same sorts of level of understanding as with long essays. Don't employ optional questions, we discussed that quite clearly. Engage a question's quality by creating a trial response to the item. Develop a model answer, ask a colleague to talk to you even about what sort of answer they would prepare based on the question that you provided. Okay,